Hey guys, let's talk about the vaccine for respiratory syncytial virus for a minute. This is a vaccine that's approved to be given to pregnant women to protect the fetus, but also approved for people 60 plus to protect them from this very significant viral infection. Now, I've been recommending this to my patients, but unfortunately in Canada, for most people, it's not covered and it costs somewhere between $200 and $300. Some of my colleagues have been asking me if that cost is justified. Should we really be recommending this vaccine for our patients? So let's talk about that for a minute. So this is the big trial of the RSV vaccine, and what they were able to show is that over a follow-up of 6.7 months, they reduced the rate of lower respiratory tract infection from RSV, which is what the vaccine is meant to do, from 0.32% to 0.056%. And that is an 83% relative risk reduction, but it is only a 0.26% absolute risk reduction. And so the question is that $200 to $300 worth it for just a 0.26% absolute risk reduction? Another way to think of this is how many people do you need to vaccinate to actually prevent one lower respiratory tract infection? And it turns out for this particular vaccine, that number is 379. So is it worth it to do 379 vaccines times $300 each to protect that one person from a lower respiratory tract infection with RSV? Overall, I do think that this vaccine still makes sense on a population level, and there are a few reasons why. So number one is that the absolute risk reduction is a function of what that population risk actually is. So trials are generally short. In this case, it was a trial over one RSV season. But this vaccine has already shown efficacy into the second RSV season, and we anticipate that it will have some efficacy even into the third RSV season and may be required every 3 years or maybe at most every 2 years. What that means is that the actual population risk over the time after the vaccine is given is actually higher because there's a higher cumulative risk with successive RSV seasons. So we can expect that the actual absolute risk reduction will be larger, and the number of people needed to vaccinate to prevent that one lower respiratory tract infection will actually be smaller than what we see based on the trial. Number two, along the same lines, is that when this trial was done, is when people were still very worried about COVID, which is not the case anymore, and people were still taking lots of precautions. So again, arguably, people were masking, people were distancing. All of that is not happening nearly to the same extent now, so that the population risk is higher now than it was for people in the trial. And again, with a higher population risk now, when you're actually rolling out these vaccines, we would expect a better absolute risk reduction and a better benefit. Number three is that there is a precedent for health systems, and in Canada, at least governments, paying for preventative measures, including vaccines, that have a similar, if not lower, absolute risk reduction. So if you think about the COVID booster during the Omicron wave, it probably had a number needed to vaccinate to prevent a severe infection of about 200 people, so a little bit better than what we're talking about with the RSV vaccine. But nowadays, when we talk about COVID boosters in a very immune population, the number needed to vaccinate to actually prevent a severe infection is probably north of 1,000, but COVID boosters are still covered by the government. Another good example is the pneumonia vaccine for people who are 65 plus. The number needed to vaccinate to prevent that severe pneumonia infection is likely over 1,000 in any one season, but that's a vaccine that has an impact for several years, so the number needed to vaccinate comes down to that 200 to 300 range over time. I think it will be very similar for the RSV vaccine. So at the end of the day, it really is a personal decision, and that's what I tell my patients. If they want to spend somewhere between $200 and $300 for that small reduction in a chance of what can be a severe and life-threatening infection. But I will say that governments and health systems do pay for things with a very similar threshold, preventative things like vaccines and certain preventative medications, so that on a population level, this seems like a reasonable intervention.